incompatible, and they went their separate ways. Decades later, in her autobiography, Confessions of an Art Addict, Peggy Guggenheim would claim that among the many famous figures she had encountered, only 3 immediately struck her as geniuses: the surrealist Max Ernst, the sculptor Alberto Giacometti, and Samuel Beckett. This was apparently not hindsight. In her own words, when she had first met Beckett, he had been merely a frustrated writer, a pure intellectual. But despite their difficulties and their disparate attitudes, she had detected in him an exceptional creative spark, a spark that Beckett himself was far from sure he possessed at the time. Joyce, too, claimed to see this. Others believed in Beckett even when he did not believe in himself, though it would still be many years before such faith was justified. Meanwhile, the heavy drinking continued. Un ballon rouge, drunk at the zinc counter of a small Paris café, cost little more than a box of matches, and Beckett would regularly end up making the rounds of the late-night cafés in Montparnasse, where he now lived. Despite his hectic nightlife, he still found time for exercise, playing occasional games of tennis with expatriate friends who invited him to a private club on the outskirts of Paris. For mixed doubles, he was occasionally partnered by a talented French pianist called Suzanne de Chevaux-Duménil. It was also at this time that Beckett formed a close friendship with a Swiss-Italian sculptor, Alberto Giacometti, who shared Beckett's solitariness, fondness for late-night bars, and sardonic view of the world. The two insomniacs would share long, understanding silences at the bar, pondering the evils of the world between draining their glasses. Giacometti had an unabashed penchant for prostitutes, and Beckett appears to have joined him in this pursuit as well as exploring the field on his own. Almost certainly, as a result of this, Beckett became involved in an incident in Montparnasse late one night in January 1938. In the course of an argument with a pimp who appeared to know him and wanted to borrow some money, Beckett was stabbed in the chest. He fell to the ground and was quickly rushed to the hospital. Here it was found that the knife blade had barely missed his heart and lung. He was lucky to be alive. Beckett had long been prone to hypochondria, but now that the affliction was both genuine and serious, he behaved stoically. When news of Beckett's injury reached Dublin, his mother and brother immediately set off on the quickest route to Paris, which in those days involved a gruelling 24 hours of continuous travelling, including 2 ferry crossings and 3 rail journeys. Beckett was deeply moved by his mother's evident concern, and they appear to have effected an awkward reconciliation. The events had a deep effect upon Beckett, and even broke his writer's block. In his hospital bed he found himself writing poetry again. Another hospital visitor was Beckett's tennis partner, Suzanne. Although she was 38 and thus 6 years older than Beckett, it quickly became clear that she was attracted to him. When Beckett left the hospital, they began going out together. They made an unlikely couple. He drank, she did not. He lived a bohemian life, she preferred lace-making. But they quickly discovered a mutual interest in classical music and the arts. In time they became lovers. Unlike Peggy Guggenheim, however, Suzanne appeared to have a more calming effect on Beckett. As Peggy Guggenheim cattily remarked about Suzanne, she made curtains while I made scenes. In the summer of 1939, Beckett received the royalties he was due from the publication of Murphy and travelled to Ireland to see his mother. During the visit, Britain and France declared war on Germany, plunging Europe into World War II. Ireland remained neutral, but to the consternation of his mother, Beckett insisted upon returning to Paris, telling her, "I promised so many friends that I would be back." By now Beckett and Suzanne were living together in a small flat on the Rue des Favorites, a grim, featureless street south of Montparnasse. In the spring of 1940, the Germans invaded France, quickly approaching Paris. Beckett and Suzanne fled with thousands of refugees who headed south, but eventually made their way back to German-occupied Paris. Beckett had no wish to return to Ireland, and Suzanne was equally reluctant to return to live with her parents in provincial Troyes. Back in Paris, Beckett soon joined a resistance network. With characteristic diffidence and more than a little truth, he later characterized his actions as Boy Scout stuff. But there is no doubting the fact that this involved real danger. After the war, Beckett would be awarded the Croix de Guerre for his efforts, though he typically omitted to tell anyone of this for many years. In 1942, the Germans penetrated the resistance cell with which Beckett was involved. He and Suzanne immediately left the Rue des Favorites and went on the run. After being put up at various secret addresses in Paris, they set off south with false papers for unoccupied Vichy France, which was run by Pétain's collaborationist government. For days they tramped the roads, sometimes in despair, often bickering in their extremity. Elements of this dialogue would later surface in the absurd exchanges between Vladimir and Estragon in Beckett's Waiting for Godot. Estragon: "I can't go on like this." Vladimir: "That's what you think." Vladimir: "Well, shall we go?" Estragon: "Yes, let's go." They do not move. Eventually, Beckett and Suzanne reached the remote village of Roussillon in the craggy hills above the Rhône Delta, some 400 miles south of Paris. Here they hid out for the remainder of the war, doing occasional farm work to help pay for their keep. Beckett would sometimes join the local Maquis, resistance, on armed night patrols. These were largely futile exercises involving 20-mile hikes across rugged heathland, intended to bolster morale. Beckett soon fell into deep dejection, but attempted to keep up his spirits by beginning a novel which would eventually be called What?, his first sustained creative work in more than 5 years. What would mark a break from Beckett's previous work? Gone is the self-conscious intellectualism, the tendency to pretentious superiority. In its place comes a distinctly neurotic sense of futility, as Beckett attempts to explore and embody various philosophical questions in concrete form. This is achieved by what would become a distinctly Beckett-like form of reductionism, which, besides reducing the narrative to its bare bones, also involves a reductio ad absurdum of the entire novelistic genre. In one sense, What marks a serious deepening of Beckett's psychological affinities. Previously, Murphy had shown deep empathy with the schizophrenics in the Mercy Seat Asylum. In the case of Watt, the eponymous hero unmistakably is schizophrenic, both in his actions and in the obsessive way in which his story is recounted. We are introduced to Watt in slapstick fashion. Watt bumped into a porter wheeling a milk can. Watt fell, and his hat and bags were scattered. The porter did not fall, but he let go his can, which fell back with a thump on its tilted rim, rocked rattling on its base, and finally came to a stand. This was a happy chance, for had it fallen on its side... In basic outline, the story has a symbolic, distinctly Kafkaesque simplicity. After a series of tragi-farcical mishaps, the bedraggled Watt turns up at the house of Mr. Knott, where he is to work as a servant. After being subjected to a seemingly endless diatribe by the departing servant he is replacing, Watt takes up his duties on the ground floor, performing his allotted menial tasks. Eventually he graduates to the top of the house, where he looks after the bedroom, taking the place of Erskine, whose employment has come to an end. During this time in the house, Watt's life revolves around the mysterious but elusive Mr. Knott, the master of the house. Mr. Knott saw nobody, heard from nobody, as far as Watt could see, but Watt was not so foolish as to draw any conclusion from this. The latter observation is the key to Watt's overriding philosophical attitude toward the world. Watt catches a few glimpses of Mr. Knott, the most notable being of him meditating in the garden. Otherwise Mr. Knott remains unknown, seemingly defined only by negation. The narrative of the story is characterized by neurotic obsession with detail and repetition. This comes across as perverse, psychotic, or humorous, depending upon one's attitude toward the repetitive goings-on in which Watt becomes involved. At first these appear trivial to the point of tediousness, but they soon open up into a world of deeper meaning. What distressed Watt in this incident, and in subsequent similar incidents, was not so much that he did not know what had happened, for he did not care what had happened, as that nothing had happened, that a thing that was nothing had happened, with the utmost formal distinctness, and that it continued to happen in his mind, he supposed, though he did not know exactly what that meant, and though it seemed to be outside him, before him, about him, and so on. This may appear as a distinctly obsessive and oblique examination of the nature of existence, but there is no doubting its philosophical penetration. Such passages do not make for easy reading, and indeed there are times when it is almost impossible to continue without one's mind drifting into something akin to involuntary schizophrenia. Yet there is no denying the depth. In her own words, when she had first met Beckett, he had been merely a frustrated writer, a pure intellectual. But despite their difficulties and their disparate attitudes, she had detected in him, though it would still be many years before such faith was justified. Meanwhile, the heavy drinking continued. En Ballon Rouge, drunk at the zinc counter, only 3 immediately struck her as geniuses: the surrealist Max Ernst, the sculptor Alberto Giacometti, and Samuel Beckett. This was apparently not hindsight, him an exceptional creative spark, a spark that Beckett himself was far from sure he possessed at the time. Joyce, too, claimed to see this. Others believed in Beckett even when he did not believe in himself compatible, and they went their separate ways. Decades later, in her autobiography, Confessions of an Art Addict, Peggy Guggenheim would claim that among the many famous figures she had encountered,